The battlefield was a symphony of chaos, a relentless cacophony of explosions, gunfire, and the distant hum of aircraft. Amidst it all, Sergeant Michael Anders, a seasoned artillery gunner, stood resolute behind the massive 105mm howitzer. He had been in the army long enough to know the rhythm of war. Each blast, each order, each movement was a part of the same terrifying dance that had consumed his life for years. But today felt different. The enemy was closing in. The stakes were higher than ever before. It was the summer of 1944, and the Allies were pushing deep into German-occupied France. The ground shook beneath Anders' boots as another shell exploded in the distance, sending dirt and debris raining down. He didn't flinch. He had learned long ago that fear and hesitation had no place in artillery. The gun had to be loaded, aimed, and fired relentlessly without pause. "Fire!" shouted Lieutenant Harris, his voice barely audible over the roar of battle. Anders, with practiced efficiency, pulled the lanyard. The gun recoiled violently, sending a shockwave through his arms. A deafening boom filled the air, followed by the sound of the shell whistling through the sky, its deadly payload aimed at the advancing enemy positions. "Target hit!" came the voice of Corporal Jenkins, the spotter, his voice filled with brief satisfaction. Direct hit on the enemy trench, but Anders knew that one hit wasn't enough. The Germans were relentless, and they had fortified their positions well. The sound of artillery fire was a constant in the air, but it was the impact that mattered. That's what kept them fighting, and it was what kept them alive. As the gun was reloaded, Anders glanced to his left, where his crew worked with quiet precision. Corporal Jenkins adjusted the targeting scope, Sergeant Miller loaded the shell, and Private Stevens secured the base. It was a team effort. Every shot, every round, every calculation depended on each of them working in perfect harmony. But it was Anders' hand that guided the fire. He was the one who had to make it count. "Another shell inbound," shouted Jenkins, pulling Anders' focus back to the task at hand. The enemy was returning fire, their artillery rounds exploding dangerously close to their position. The air crackled with tension. "Ready the next shell," Anders barked, his voice steady despite the rising panic in the air. He adjusted his headset, listening intently for the next order. The bombardment continued, but they had a job to do. His crew worked like clockwork, each movement a practiced motion. The gun was loaded again, and the next round was ready to fire. "Fire!" The word was out before Anders had even realized he said it. The gun roared again, sending another shell into the air. The recoil vibrated through his body, but he remained focused, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the shell would land. "Direct hit, Sergeant," Jenkins called out. But Anders didn't allow himself a moment of triumph. He was already calculating the next shot. The enemy was relentless, and their artillery was beginning to land closer and closer. They had to keep up the pressure. Hours passed like this, firing, reloading, adjusting. The world around them was a blur of smoke and fire, the ground trembling beneath their feet as explosions rocked the earth. And yet, there was no time to stop, no time to breathe. The gun had to be fired again and again until their enemies were silenced. Finally, the battle seemed to quiet, the enemy artillery diminishing, their forces retreating. The air was thick with dust, and the cries of wounded soldiers echoed from every direction. Sergeant Anders looked out over the battlefield. Fields once green were now scarred and blackened, littered with debris and the wreckage of war. It was a victory, but not one that tasted sweet. There were too many lives lost on both sides. As the artillery unit began to pack up, Anders stood still, staring into the distance. His hands were stained with the marks of war, grime, sweat, and the faint residue of powder from the gun. The barrel of the howitzer, still warm from the barrage, glinted in the dying light of the afternoon. The sound of the battlefield faded into the distance, replaced by a solemn silence. He thought about home, about the life he had left behind, about the promise he had made to himself that he would survive this war. He had done his job and his crew had done theirs. But war had a way of marking men in ways that nothing else could. Anders knew that, no matter how many rounds he fired, no matter how many shells he launched, he would carry this day with him forever. The war wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for now they had won. And that would have to be enough.